At 31, Mara Bell Whitcomb was told the law had made her homeless. The house was gone. The mule shed was gone. The little rain barrel her husband had patched with tin and wire, gone. Even the strip of shade beside the kitchen wall now belonged to another man. But the men who emptied her porch made one mistake. They believed a woman only owns what can be written on paper. Mara owned something older than paper. She knew where the desert kept its cold. In the summer of 1887, the New Mexico territory was already turning white with heat. The settlement of Cinder Wells sat low in a basin of alkali dust and mesquite, with mountains to the west and a broken black ridge to the east, where old lava and red sandstone had cracked apart like burned bread. People did not build near that ridge. They pointed at it from the road and called it Mule Bone Draw, because anything that wandered in there too far usually came out as bones. That was the place Mara looked toward when Judd Varnell rode up to her house with a folded deed in his coat pocket. He came with Amos Whitcomb, her dead husband's older brother. Amos was not cruel in the loud way. He did not shout. He did not need to. He had the deed. He had the debt note. And he had Judd Varnell, who ran the land office, the general store, and most of the town's opinions. Judd stepped down slowly, keeping his gloves on. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, "the grace period ended this morning." Mara stood in the yard beside everything she was allowed to keep: a skillet, a quilt, a packet of sewing needles, a tin cup, a small leather book with her father's name written inside the cover, and in her hand a cracked dairy thermometer with a brass cap and a red line thin as a vein. Her husband Eli had bought it from a traveling peddler the year before the fever took him. He had laughed when he brought it home, saying they could finally prove whether July was as wicked as everyone claimed. Now it was the most exact witness she owned. Amos looked at the bundle and then at the house. "It isn't personal, Mara." That was what men said when they wanted to make cruelty sound like weather. "The note is on Eli's name," Amos continued. "The land pays the note. I take the note. I take the land." Mara did not argue. She had already taken her argument to every door that mattered, and every door had opened just wide enough for refusal. The boarding room was full. The church pantry was short. The town did not have the means. The law was regrettable. The arrangement was unfortunate. Judd Varnell adjusted his hat and looked past her, as if she had already become part of the dust. "You have until sundown to clear the threshold," he said. "After that, Mrs. Whitcomb, you will be trespassing." Trespassing. On the kitchen floor she had scrubbed. Under the roof she had helped Eli raise. Beside the grave she had dug for him with a borrowed shovel. Mara looked at Judd Varnell. Then she looked past him, toward the black ridge beyond town. "I'll be gone before dark," she said. The two men heard defeat. They should have heard measurement. By sunset, the porch was empty. By morning, Bell Whitcomb was gone. For 2 days, Cinder Wells gave her the small funeral it gave to anyone inconvenient. They said she had walked south toward the mail road. They said a widow with no wagon could not cross the flats in June. They said the desert was a hard teacher. What they did not say was that she had left no trail toward the mail road at all. A mule freighter named Lyle Merrick noticed that first. He was a quiet man with a split-lip scar and the patience of someone who made his living at 3 miles an hour. He stopped by the Whitcomb place to ask after Mara and found Amos's wife hanging wash in the yard. "She moved on," the woman said too quickly. Lyle looked down. Near the road, the dust still held the shallow print of a woman's boot. Not south, not west, east, straight toward Mulebone Draw. The print was nearly gone already, but it was there, and beside it, half buried in grit, was the little thermometer Mara must have dropped and returned for, because the sand around it had been brushed by careful fingers. Lyle picked it up for a moment. The red line stood at 104 degrees. It was not yet 11 in the morning. He put the thermometer back where he found it. Then he looked toward the ridge and felt the thought every desert man hates to feel. A woman had gone where the heat had no mercy, and she had gone on purpose. Mara was not walking into Mulebone Draw because she thought it would spare her. She was walking there because her father had once taught her that the surface is not the whole world. Jonah Bell had been a cistern mason in Missouri, a man who dug spring houses, lined root cellars, and built stone rooms beneath farmyards where milk stayed sweet long after the porch butter went rancid. He never used words like thermal mass. He did not know the language of engineers. He knew the feel of a wall that had not seen sun. When Mara was 9, she sat on the lip of a cellar pit while her father cut shelves into yellow clay. August pressed on the farm like a wet hand. Above ground, flies circled the buttercrock, and the boards of the house breathed heat. But 10 feet down, Jonah stood in blue shadow with his sleeves rolled up, smiling like he had found a secret. "Come down here, Mara." She climbed the ladder, barefoot and suspicious. At the bottom, the air changed. It was not cold exactly. It was steadier than cold. Her father took a wet cloth from a bucket and pressed it into her hands. She gasped. He laughed. "That's the deep cool," he said. "Sun can whip the roof, wind can dry the creek, but the ground remembers slowly. Deep ground doesn't panic." He showed her how a room under earth could hold springtime in July, how a low opening could draw heavier, cool air, how a high opening could let warm air escape, how a wet cloth in a draft could steal heat from the air because water carried it away as it vanished. "Most folks fight weather from the outside," he told her. "They slap up shade and pray the wind feels charitable. But the smart way is to let the earth carry half the burden." Those lessons had slept in Mara for 20 years. In Cinder Wells, people built above ground because boards were faster than stone, and pride liked windows. They trusted porches, canvas awnings, shallow wells, and the memory of ordinary summers. But June of 1887 was not ordinary. By the time Mara reached Mulebone Draw, her tongue was swollen, her dress was gray with dust, and the red cliffs in front of her seemed to breathe heat. She followed the one sign nobody in town would have bothered to follow. A ragged line of greener scrub at the base of the Black Ridge. Not lush, not pretty, just a little less dead than everything around it. That meant moisture. At the end of that green line, behind a clawing screen of catclaw and mesquite, Mara found a split in the rock, no wider than a pantry door. She stood before it and held still. There, a breath. Not wind. Wind moves across the skin. This touched her face from below. Cool, damp, mineral. Mara closed her eyes. For 1 second, she was 9 years old again, standing in her father's cellar with a wet cloth between her hands. Then she opened her eyes and began to work. The crack was too narrow for a grown woman carrying supplies. She spent the first day prying loose stone with an iron hinge she had taken from the old smokehouse door before Amos could inventory it. Her palms blistered before noon. By evening, both hands were split at the thumb. She worked at dawn and at dusk. At midday, she lay under an overhang and kept her mouth shut so thirst would spend slower. On the second morning, the opening gave way enough for her to slide through sideways. Inside, the desert ended. The dark was not empty. It smelled of stone, old water, and earth that had never been asked to burn. Her eyes adjusted by inches. The space beyond the crack widened into a long chamber, half sandstone, half black volcanic rock, with sand on the floor and a ceiling high enough for her to stand if she kept her head bowed. At the back, she heard water. Not a stream, not enough for comfort. A drip. One clear drop every few heartbeats, falling from a seam into a hollow stone basin. Mara sat beside it for almost an hour, counting. By her best measure, the seep gathered close to a gallon every 7 hours. Enough to drink. Enough to live carefully. Enough to build. For the next 6 days, Mara turned the hollow into a machine. Not a machine of iron, a machine of stone, air, and patience. She found a lower crawl space where the cave inhaled at dawn. She found 2 narrow cracks high in the rear ceiling where warmer air escaped. With mud, pebbles, and strips from her quilt, she sealed the useless gaps so the cave would breathe where she wanted it to breathe. She wove mats from torn burlap and yucca fiber and hung them inside the entrance. At morning and evening, she soaked them with seep water. When hot, dry air pulled through that damp barrier, the water stole some of its heat and carried it away as vapor. Her father would have called it a wet door trick. Mara simply called it necessary. She dug a food pit into the coldest sand and lined it with flat rock. Beans, cornmeal, cactus fruit, and mesquite pods went there, covered and shaded. She built a sleeping ledge away from the entrance. She scratched marks into the wall to track the days. She fixed a flap of canvas over the outer crack and learned when to close it, when to lift it, and when to let the night air wash the chamber clean. Every decision had a reason. Open too long at noon, and the heat crept in. Seal too tightly, and the air went stale. Wet the burlap too early, and the water was wasted. Wet it just before the afternoon draw, and the whole passage softened. She was not hiding in a hole. She was tuning a living instrument. On the seventh day, the true test arrived. Outside, the basin went white. The sun hammered the flats until distance vanished and the town seemed to float in boiling glass. Lizards disappeared. Birds stopped calling. The iron hinge she had used as a pry bar burned her fingers when she touched it. Mara stayed inside. The entrance flap was down. The burlap was damp. The water basin was full. The little thermometer hung from a nail of mesquite root driven into a crack in the stone. Hour after hour she watched the red line. At noon it rose a little. At 2 it stopped. At 4, when the outside cliffs were too hot for a bare hand, the line held. 71 degrees. Mara stared at it until the number blurred. Above her, men with deeds and ledgers had decided she was finished. Around her, stone held its promise. The law could give her house away. The town could close every door. But the deep earth did not recognize Judd Varnell's signature. It only recognized heat, and heat obeyed rules. That night, Mara pressed her palm against the cave wall and finally let herself cry. Not because she was safe, not yet. Because for the first time since Eli's fever, the world had answered her with something honest. 2 weeks later, Cinder Wells began to fail. The town well, never dug deep enough, dropped into mud. What came up in the bucket was warm, bitter, and edged with sulfur. Chickens died under porches. A milk cow collapsed behind the livery. Children slept on rooftops and woke weaker than they had gone to bed. At midnight, the air still stood at 100 degrees. People soaked sheets and hung them over windows, but without wind, the sheets turned rooms into wet ovens. They dragged mattresses into shallow cellars, then crawled back out, gasping when the earth there gave no relief. They had built on the surface, and the surface had become the enemy. Judd Varnell heard the first rumor from Lyle Merrick. Lyle did not intend to tell him. He had gone out to Mulebone Draw out of pity, carrying a canteen and a shovel, expecting to find what desert men expect to find when someone has made a bad choice. Instead, he found a swept path, then a damp strip of burlap hanging in a rock mouth where no damp thing should have survived. "Mara?" His voice went into the dark and came back smaller. Then she appeared with a candle in her hand, thinner, dirt on her cheek, hair tied back with a strip of quilt cloth, eyes clear. Lyle did not speak for a long moment. He looked at the stone basin, the wet mats, the clean sleeping ledge, the food pit, the little lines scratched into the wall. Finally, he said, "How in God's name?" Mara lifted the candle toward the roof cracks. My father dug cold rooms. That was all she offered at first. Then, because Lyle was the sort of man who listened before he decided, she explained the rest. Low air in, warm air out. Water in cloth. Stone holding yesterday's cool and last winter's memory. A deep seep that did not care how proud the town well had been. Lyle stood there with his hat in his hands like he was inside a church. When he stepped back into daylight, the heat hit him so hard he almost cursed. He kept Mara's place quiet for 3 days. Then Judd Varnell cornered him at the freight yard and heard enough to understand that the woman he had erased was still alive. That evening, Judd and Amos rode to Mulebone Draw. They found the entrance by the track marks. Amos pushed the burlap aside without calling. "Mara!" His voice cracked against the stone. She came from the inner chamber with the calm of a person interrupted at work. Judd looked around and saw the thing he hated most. Order. Not desperation, not madness, not a widow half dead and ready to bargain. Order. "This ridge is part of the Whitcomb parcel," Judd said. "You are still on land attached to the note." Mara looked at the cave wall. "I am not on it," she let the words settle. "I am under it." Amos's face reddened. "You cannot make a house out of a crack in the ground." "I already have." Judd stepped close enough to feel the cool air on his neck. For a moment, he understood the danger. Not the legal danger, the human one. If Mara survived here, then the town had not been practical. It had been blind. If her cave worked, then the men who had measured her worth in furniture and debt had missed the only thing that mattered. Judd took Amos by the sleeve. "Leave her." Outside, Amos pulled free. "We can't let her stay." Judd looked back at the dark mouth in the ridge. His expression hardened. "The heat will finish this argument," he said. "That little drip will dry. The chamber will turn foul. Give it another week." Mara heard every word. She went back inside and checked the seep. Drop, drop, drop. The cave kept time better than men kept mercy. The next thing to come to Mara's door was not a person, it was a dog. A yellow, rib-finned stray staggered into the shade of the entrance and collapsed with its tongue black at the edges. Mara found it at dawn, sides jerking, eyes dull with heat. She set a bowl of water just beyond its nose. The dog drank without lifting its head. By the second day, it could stand. Mara named it Shade because it had found the only honest shade in the basin. The first human came the evening after that. Inez Ortega arrived barefoot, carrying her 5-year-old son in both arms. The boy's name was Mateo. His head lolled against her shoulder, his lips were split. His skin burned dry under Mara's hand. Inez did not ask for charity. She looked like a woman past shame. "Lyle said you had cold air," she whispered. "Please." Mara took the child. Inside. The moment Inez crossed the threshold, she stopped walking. The cool struck her so hard her knees bent. Mara laid Mateo on her own sleeping ledge and dipped a cloth into seep water. She did not rush. Panic wasted motion, and motion wasted strength. Cloth to forehead, cloth to neck. Small spoon of water. Wait. Another spoon. Air moving slow and cold around the child's body. Inez shook so badly, Mara had to put the bowl into her hands. Not too much at once, Mara said. We cool him steady. We give the body a reason to stay. For hours they worked by candlelight. Near dawn, Mateo's breathing changed. The tight, shallow flutter loosened. Sweat broke along his hairline. His fingers curled around his mother's thumb. Inez made a sound without words. Mara sat back against the stone, exhausted. It is not a miracle, she said. Inez looked at the wet cloth, the burlap, the roof vents, the dark throat of the lower chamber. No? No. It is a lesson, and lessons can be carried. By noon, Inez's husband had walked back to Cinder Wells with more than a story. He had instructions. Dig deeper. Shade the south wall. Open low to draw air and high to vent heat. Wet cloth only where air can move. Do not waste water on rooms that cannot breathe. Stop trusting a shallow cellar just because your grandfather called it one. The next evening, 3 families came. The blacksmith brought his daughter. The liveryman's wife brought 2 infants. A miner with cracked lips came carrying his mother on a door plank. Mara let them in, but she did not let them become helpless. She divided the cave like a foreman. Men cleared fallen rock from the second chamber. Women cut and twisted cooling strips. Children carried cups from the seep basin to the storage jars. Lyle hauled flour, salt, beans, and 2 oil lamps from his freight wagon. Mara stood in the center of the cave and taught. Not gently at first. Gentleness would come after they were alive. This is the cool room, she said. No lamps burning here unless I say it. Heat is heat, even when it comes from a flame. She pointed to the entrance. That cloth stays wet only when the air is pulling. If there is no draw, you are just spending water for comfort. She pointed deeper. That seep is not a well. It is a clock. We take from it by the hour, not by fear. People listened. Because outside, fear had not helped them. Inside, her rules did. By the 3rd day, the cave held 27 people and 1 yellow dog. Its air warmed under so many bodies, and Mara felt the old danger rise in a new shape. Too many people could ruin the very system saving them. So she changed the system. She opened a second breathing slit before dawn with Lyle's pick. She moved the sickest children into the back chamber. She sent the strongest men to sleep outside the entrance at night, when the rocks finally released enough heat to be bearable. She cut lamp use in half. She set a rotation at the seep. A person with less pride would have called it command. Mara called it housekeeping. Then Amos Whitcomb came. He arrived near noon in a wagon, and the horse was trembling. His wife sat in the back with their son folded across her lap. The boy's name was Caleb, 7 years old, Eli's nephew. The child had laughed at Mara once from the porch steps while Amos's men carried away her bed frame. He had not known what he was laughing at. Children borrow cruelty before they understand its cost. Now he lay limp, eyes rolled back, mouth open. Amos stood in the white heat with his hat in his hands. He could not make himself look at her. "The doctor says he doesn't know," Amos said. His wife, Ruth, looked at Mara with a face stripped of every social defense. "Please." Behind Mara, the people in the cave went quiet. Inez Ortega stood up. The blacksmith's jaw hardened. Lyle Merrick moved one step closer, not threatening, but present. They knew what Amos had done. They knew what Judd had said. For the first time since the eviction, Mara had power enough to wound him. She looked at the boy, then at the cave, then at the faces waiting to see what kind of justice she believed in. "Bring him inside," she said. Amos lifted his son and crossed the threshold. The cool air wrapped around him, and the man made a small, broken sound before he could stop it. He had left Mara to the heat. Now the only thing between his child and death was the cold room she had built from what he had not been able to take. Mara treated Caleb exactly as she had treated Mateo. No colder, no warmer. A cloth at the neck, a spoon of water. Rest, air, time. The equality of it ruined Amos more completely than anger could have. By evening, Caleb sweated. By midnight, he slept. Amos sat against the wall with both hands over his mouth. At dawn, he found Mara near the seep, filling jars by the drop. "I took your house," he said. Mara did not look up. "Yes, I thought that meant I had taken what mattered." She corked one jar and reached for another. "You took what the paper could reach." There was nothing in that sentence for him to answer. The heat broke 3 days later, not softly. It broke with a wall of cloud over the western mountains and a wind that smelled like iron. By late afternoon, rain hit Cinder Wells in hard, slanted sheets. People ran out of houses and stood in it, laughing, crying, lifting their faces like the sky had remembered them. Inside Mulebone Draw, the cave did not flood. Mara had carved the entrance lip high enough and cut a trench for runoff, because her father had also taught her that every kindness in nature has a second edge. The rain cooled the basin. The well rose muddy, then clear. And when people returned to town, they did not return the same. No court reversed Mara's eviction. No judge rode in and corrected the ledger with a speech. The change was quieter and harder to undo. Everyone in Cinder Wells now knew the truth. Judd Varnell had owned the paper. Amos had owned the house. Mara had owned the knowledge that kept their children alive. That summer, a meeting was held in the schoolhouse after sunset because the building could not be occupied by day. Judd tried to keep his place at the front. Nobody stopped him. They simply stopped listening. One by one, families stood and told what had happened in the cave. Inez spoke of Mateo's fever breaking. The blacksmith spoke of his daughter breathing easier in the back chamber. Ruth Whitcomb stood with Caleb's hand in hers and said that Mara had saved the boy after she had been given every reason not to. By the end of the meeting, Amos signed the house and East Ridge back to Mara. Judd Varnell witnessed it because the room made him. But Mara never moved back into the house. She used it for storage, then for teaching, then for travelers who came to see what a town could learn when pride almost killed it. Her home stayed in the ridge. People began calling it Mara's Below. Over the next 30 summers, Cinder Wells changed shape. Thick adobe replaced thin clapboard. Houses were turned to catch morning shade and refuse the west sun. Every new cellar had a low intake and a high vent. Water jars were buried in stone-lined pits. Burlap cooling frames hung where air could actually pass through them. No one in town used the phrase, "just a widow," where Mara could hear it. After a few years, they stopped using it at all. Lyle Merrick's freight route always ended at the ridge, even when the freight did not. He brought books, lamp oil, coffee, and news from Santa Fe. He helped Mara build shelves into the cave wall and a wooden door that sealed tight against midday heat. He never asked her to leave the place that had given her back to herself. Their companionship was not the kind songs are written about. It was quieter. A chair repaired before it broke. A water jar filled without being mentioned. A lantern left at the right bend in the passage. Two people who understood that loyalty is mostly repetition. Once, a newspaperman came from Albuquerque after hearing about the widow who had made a cold house in a desert ridge. He wanted a marvel, a miracle, a headline. Mara gave him a thermometer, a cup of seep water, and an hour-long airflow. He kept trying to make the story larger than it was. She kept making it exact. "The earth did not favor me," she told him. "It followed its own laws. I survived because my father taught me to notice them." The article he printed was shorter than he wanted and better than he knew. It called her a hermit. The town sent a correction. They called her a teacher. Mara Bell Whitcomb lived to 82. In her last years, she moved slowly through the cave with one hand on the wall, still checking vents before storms, still listening to the seep, still scolding children who left doors open during the heat of the day. Caleb Whitcomb, the boy she had saved, became the town mason. Mateo Ortega became a schoolmaster. Together, they built the new school half into a hill, with thick walls and a shaded court. And on its first July afternoon, the classroom held at 78 degrees, while the road outside shimmered at 112. That was the late proof. Not one saved child. Not one summer survived. A whole town had learned to build below its pride. Mara died before dawn in March, with cool stone around her and the sound of the seep counting softly in the dark. They buried her on the ridge beside Lyle, under a marker made of black basalt. The town lasted another generation. Then the railroad moved. The highway missed the basin. Cinder Wells thinned, boarded up, and surrendered to dust. By 1956, only the schoolhouse walls, the old storefront, and a few roofless homes remained above ground. That autumn, 2 architecture students from the university drove out to sketch abandoned adobe structures and found a set of stone steps behind mesquite. They followed them into the ridge. The wooden door had rotted loose. The burlap frames were gray strings. The shelves sagged. But the air still changed at the threshold. One student stopped and whispered, "Do you feel that?" Deep in the chamber, water still fell from the seam. Drop, drop, drop. On a stone ledge beside the seep, they found a brass-capped dairy thermometer, dusty but unbroken. The red line rested at 71 degrees. Outside, the abandoned town baked under a hard white sky. Inside, the stone kept the lesson. The men of Cinder Wells had once taken everything they knew how to name. They took the house, they took the deed, they took the surface of her life. But they never reached the place where her real inheritance waited. Because paper can claim land. Only knowledge knows how to live inside it.